It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Robert Bonnie. Robert has come a long way from his early days as a boy growing up on a farm in Kentucky to his current position as Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it is great pride that I note that that trajectory included a stint at the Nicholas School as a graduate student. Indeed, Robert Bonnie graduated from the Nicholas School in 1994 with a Master of Environmental Management in Resource Economics and a Master of Forestry. After leaving Duke, Robert worked at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he was Vice President for Land Conservation and spearheaded efforts to develop new incentives to reward farmers, ranchers, and forest owners for stewardship activities on private lands. Robert left Environmental Defense Fund in 2009 to become the Senior Advisor for Environment and Climate to the Secretary of Agriculture, and in 2013, the Senate confirmed his current appointment as Undersecretary. In this capacity, Robert supervises the U.S. Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service and works closely with the Farm Service Agency. And I might point out, I learned this morning that, in fact, he basically oversees all the fire protection and putouts that go on, wildfire putouts that go on in the United States. And if he refers to his phone at any part during this activity, it's because he's checking for fires. And we just hope that one doesn't break out, otherwise he'll have to leave in the middle of his speech. And I asked if I could take his phone. He said no. Robert served on the Nicholas School's Board of Visitors from 2004 to 2010, and in 2007 he received the school's Rising Star Award for Outstanding Young Alumni. Robert is emblematic of what it means to be a Nicholas School alum. He is an agent of change and innovation who has helped develop groundbreaking market-based programs that have reduced greenhouse gases and landmark initiatives such as the State Safe Harbors Agreement that has protected a dozen or more endangered species on more than 3 million acres of land nationwide. There's also a personal note to this story. I first met Robert in 2005 when I joined the Environmental Defense Fund as their chief scientist. And my first interaction with Robert, I believe, was an interesting one. It was during a phone call, and it concerned, I think it was methane emissions from forests. And I believe if methane serves, Robert and I had a difference of opinion. In fact, a rather heated difference of opinion. Robert, if you know him, will know that he remained calm. Myself, I suspect not so much. Nevertheless, we eventually found common ground, and I have come to admire and respect the man enormously. In a time when we find so many things about government to criticize, we can all be assured and proud that we have someone of Robert's intellect, commitment, and integrity in D.C. doing the people's business. A true champion of the environment and a strong supporter of the Nicholas School, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Robert Bonnie.
Thank you, Bill. Graduates, faculty members, parents, distinguished guests, it's an honor to be with you today. As I stand here today, it's not lost on me that I was a member of the School of the Environment's class of 1994. And while it wouldn't be until December of '94 that I would graduate, it doesn't seem possible that I am nearly 20 years removed from this place. Of course, much has changed since I left Duke. In the fall of 1991, I had applied to the Duke School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. In the fall of '92, I arrived not at the School of Forestry, but at the Duke School of the Environment. Soon after I left, the school became known as the Nicholas School. While we made our home on a couple of floors of the Biosciences Building, and later the Levine Center, the school now has a new home which provides not only an unparalleled facility, but does so in a way that demonstrates that outstanding architectural design and environmental sustainability can be and should be mutually reinforcing. The last 2 decades have brought other changes. In 1994, my fellow students and I were unaware that we were about to witness a technological revolution that would change all of our daily lives. At that time, Geographic Information Systems, GIS, was a brand new and somewhat clunky tool whose promise was not yet fully realized. Students were assigned these new things called email accounts, which seemed useful but not essential. The internet was still in its infancy, and none of us owned cell phones. With respect to environmental issues of the day, old-growth timber wars, endangered species conflicts, wetland conservation, and clean air received most of the media attention. Climate change, while a growing concern, had not yet begun to dominate conversations about environmental sustainability. The Nicholas School has been strengthened in the intervening years, both in its contributions to environmental conservation and in its reputation. We can credit sound leadership by the university and the school itself. Bill Shimides has been integral to the growth of the Nicholas School. And as Bill mentioned, I first met Bill at Environmental Defense Fund. There, Bill strengthened EDF's commitment to scientific integrity, to its ability to communicate science for a broad public consumption. Bill's academic contributions, both as a researcher and as a leader of this school, have been enormously important in advancing our understanding of environmental challenges while building a new generation of students and practitioners whose contributions will be manifest for years to come. One constant about this school over the last 35 years that seemed until very recently that it would never change was the leadership of the Duke Forest by Judd Edburn. Judd has been enormously important in advancing the forest as a truly unique research facility and as a place of learning, but also as a refuge for an afternoon hike, and importantly, as a conservation gem within the confines of the rapidly growing Research Triangle. We ought to honor both Judd and the school by making sure we continue to manage and conserve the Duke Forest for future generations of Duke students. Okay, there's one applause line in this speech. That was it. Despite the retirements of both Bill and Judd, the Nicholas School is in an even stronger position than when I was a student in undertaking world-class research, and perhaps even more importantly, in providing a continual flow of graduates who have the interdisciplinary tools and the leadership to address our growing environmental challenges. And as one who's been in the field now for some 20 years, we need you. Whether you are pursuing a career in the private sector, with a nonprofit organization, in the government, in academia, the world needs you. Indeed, if there's one thing that has changed since I left the School of the Environment, it's that the challenges we face are more comprehensive and more complex than we previously understood. But despite all the changes over the last 2 decades, one thing that has not only not changed, in fact it has deteriorated, has been the divide between America's political parties on a range of issues, and in particular around environmental issues. Political discourse today is punctuated by many who still deny the science of climate change. And there are loud voices who call for the transfer of federal lands to the states or who broadly oppose other fundamental environmental protections. Now, while I'm a Democrat, let me be clear that I do not intend this as a partisan swipe against any one party. There's far more that we can all do to foster a more reasoned conversation around environmental issues. Advocates on both sides should be less quick to demonize their opponents or to seek a flashy headline in newspaper or websites when a more nuanced approach is more appropriate, or to stir the passions of our respective constituents when reasoned conversation would benefit the resource. This polarization has had real consequences for the nation's environmental policies. Though our understanding of environmental challenges over the last 2 decades has grown substantially, our knowledge has not resulted in significant changes or improvements to our nation's environmental laws. Indeed, today's major national environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, are basically unchanged since I was at the School of the Environment 20 years ago. It's a strange paradox that while there has been tremendous growth over the last few decades in the public's understanding of environmental issues, and in the public's support for environmental conservation, this has not been reflected in our national politics. This isn't to suggest that there hasn't been considerable progress in their intervening years. There has been, and in many cases, enormous progress. But because of the divide amongst our congressional leaders, this progress has taken place largely outside of Congress. For example, 20 years ago, the Endangered Species Act was being pilloried by many for placing spotted owls, red-cockaded woodpeckers, and other wildlife in the way of economic progress and of stripping landowners of their property rights. While there were attempts to update the law in Congress, the middle ground was too elusive, and so the advocates on both sides simply gave up trying. When I began my work on the conservation of the red-cockaded woodpecker while at Duke, many landowners and foresters were openly hostile to the bird and to endangered species. I attended one meeting where a local landowner's license plate read, "I eat RCWs." Remarkably, that landowner later enrolled his family lands in a safe harbor conservation agreement, under which the family made a commitment to conserve habitat for the bird in exchange for assurances that limited their liability under the Endangered Species Act. And this tool, which uses regulatory incentives for conservation, has now caught on in ecosystems across the country. Over the last 2 decades, cooperative approaches such as safe harbor agreements, direct financial incentives, habitat conservation plans, candidate conservation agreements, conservation banks, have fundamentally redefined the way the Endangered Species Act applies to private lands. Today, it's a fundamentally different law, not because Congress changed the statute, but because those who cared about wildlife recognized that conservation must work for landowners too. And today, there's less strife around endangered species, and most importantly, there are many places where the Act is working not just to stem the decline of rare species, but to increase their numbers. This considerable progress was made by those who dared to listen, to sit down with those who may have at first seemed like adversaries, and to bring creativity, commitment, and resources to the table. There's a similar transformation now happening regarding the management of the nation's 193 million acre system of national forests and grasslands, managed by the U.S. Forest Service. When I was a student at Duke, the Pacific Northwest was still in a pitched battle which pitted the fate of old-growth forests and spotted owls against the timber industry and rural jobs. This type of conflict was being played out in many other forests across the country as well. Today, the forest health issues which plague many of our national forests, decades of fire suppression, catastrophic wildfire, widespread bark beetle infestations, the need for ecological restoration. These threats are serving to unite former foes. Many environmentalists recognize that forest restoration is far more difficult without a vibrant timber industry. Likewise, the industry increasingly understands the value of the social license that comes from broad stakeholder support for forest management and restoration. So in national forests across the country, environmentalists, forest industry, county officials, and others are working together to develop landscape-scale restoration projects that restore forests for the benefits of watersheds and wildlife, while providing increased timber supply to local mills. In both instances, endangered species and national forest conservation, positive change is being driven by those who choose to engage, who choose to listen, and who choose to seek common ground. So while the political rhetoric around wildlife and forests is still too often infected with voices who seek to fan the flames of division, the progress on the ground tells a different story. There's an emerging consensus around these issues that belies much of the political rhetoric we hear in Congress and state legislatures. And now we must forge a similar consensus around other environmental issues, and in particular around climate change. And indeed, even without the immediate prospect of federal legislation, there's meaningful progress already being made. President Obama is taking substantial steps to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from power plants and from cars. The administration is taking a leadership role in international efforts to address climate change. Federal agencies are also taking significant steps to address climate resilience through agency adaptation plans, infrastructure investments, and other means. But it's not just the government that is acting. States and local governments are acting as well. Businesses are also investing in new technologies to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So even while we still confront considerable resistance to addressing climate change through national legislation, we are seeing the emergence of a national consensus to act. Though Congress is lagging behind today, it will eventually embrace this emerging consensus so that the politics of the environment, the public's support for environmental protection, and the need for action once again are aligned. Our job, more specifically, your job, is to further this emerging consensus, not only as it relates to climate change, but also conservation of our oceans and estuaries, conservation of drinking water and watersheds, and many other environmental issues. There will be new approaches using business, market, science, technology, and innovative policy that you will help develop that advance environmental stewardship while enhancing jobs and economic growth. Now, if all this seems a little overwhelming, let me give you some advice that was given to me when I graduated from college. As I sat with my classmates a few hours before graduation, Reverend Peter Gomes, an African-American Episcopal minister who spoke like a proper Boston blue blood, told the assembled students that while most of them were ready to run through the college gates to conquer the world, they should think small. That is, remember that you alone can't solve all the world's problems immediately. So think small. Take your piece of the environmental puzzle, whether you're in business, government, a nonprofit organization, academia, or otherwise, and work to solve it one piece at a time. And as you engage on your piece of the puzzle, I suspect you will learn, as I have, that you will accomplish nothing by yourself. Instead, you'll succeed by engaging stakeholders, building trust and common understanding, sharing credit, and being willing to stand in the background when necessary. Remember that cynicism is the enemy, that optimism is a virtue, and that it's important to have fun while you're doing this work. If you do, when you return in the year 2034, you'll be able to note that you and your classmates helped build a new environmental consensus, a consensus that will be broadly reflected across our economy, our society, and across our government. Partisan differences will certainly remain as to how we achieve our environmental goals, but there will be no question that we must achieve them. If my last 20 years has been any measure, the Nicholas School has prepared you for what will be an incredibly rewarding journey. Good luck.